The table was set for two, just as it had been every year. Margaret had polished the silver herself, the way her mother once taught her, until she could see her tired reflection staring back. The candles flickered softly, bathing Harold's face in a forgiving glow. 47 years of marriage, nearly half a century of routines, promises, arguments, and shared silences. She smiled as she watched him pour the wine, though her chest ached with the familiar absence of their son, David. Every anniversary carried that shadow. The night of his disappearance lived in the spaces between their words. Margaret had convinced herself long ago that time dulled grief, yet tonight it felt raw again, gnawing at her as she traced the rim of her glass. 47 years, Harold said, lifting his drink. His voice was steady, but his eyes avoided hers. We've made it through everything. Margaret wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe their survival meant something stronger than sorrow. She leaned back, letting the warmth of nostalgia flood her. The memory of their first kiss, the house they'd built, the quiet mornings with coffee. Yet the image of David's empty bedroom always cut through like broken glass. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, louder than usual. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to ask Harold if he still thought of David every night, or if time had finally granted him peace. But before the words formed, 3 sharp knocks echoed from the front door. Both of them froze. At this hour, on this night. Harold set his glass down, his hand trembling just enough for Margaret to notice. She rose slowly, her heart stuttering. The air felt colder, as if the walls themselves held their breath. When she opened the door, 2 figures stood beneath the porch light, suits pressed, badges gleaming. The taller one spoke first, his tone clipped and official. Mrs. Walker? Mr. Walker? We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. May we come in? Margaret's throat tightened. Behind her, Harold's chair scraped against the floor. The anniversary, the candles, the fragile peace, all of it shattered in that instant. The perfect night was no longer theirs. It belonged to the truth. The taller agent introduced himself as Special Agent Collins, his partner a quiet woman named Ramirez. Their presence filled the room with an authority that pressed down on Margaret's chest. The candles still flickered on the table behind her, grotesque in their cheerfulness, as if mocking the heaviness that had invaded the house. We're reopening the case of your son, David Walker, Collins said plainly. His words sliced through the air like a blade. We've uncovered new information that requires your cooperation. Margaret's breath caught. She gripped the back of her chair to steady herself, though her knuckles whitened against the polished wood. For decades, she had dreamed of this moment, a door creaking open to truth, justice inching closer. Yet now, faced with it, terror knotted in her stomach. Her eyes flicked to Harold. His complexion had drained of color, the healthy pink replaced by a gray pallor. He tried to mask it with a cough, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Margaret stared, confusion swirling with dread. Why did he look so afraid? Collins continued, his voice professional yet sharp. We'll need to speak with both of you separately. We believe someone close to David may have withheld crucial details the night he vanished. The silence that followed pressed harder than the agent's words. Margaret felt it in her bones, in the hollow ache of her chest. The ticking clock seemed louder, each second a hammer against her skull. Harold said nothing, not a word of protest, not a question, not even disbelief. Just silence. Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came. Her throat was sandpaper, her heart a drum pounding for escape. All she could do was glance at Harold again, searching for comfort, for solidarity. But his eyes darted away, unable to meet hers. For the first time in 47 years, Margaret wondered if she had ever truly known the man sitting across from her. Collins' voice broke the silence. We'll return tomorrow morning to begin formal interviews. He left his card on the table, its white rectangle glowing against the crimson cloth. As the door shut behind them, the house seemed to collapse into itself. The silence screamed. The house was too quiet after the agents left, as if the walls themselves were listening. Margaret washed the wine glasses with slow, trembling hands, each clink against porcelain sharp enough to make her flinch. Upstairs, Harold moved about with unusual haste, shutting drawers, pacing the hallway. The rhythm of his steps felt wrong, uneven, urgent. When she finally climbed into bed beside him, the silence stretched unbearably. She turned toward him in the dim glow of the lamp. "Harold," she whispered, her voice softer than she intended. "Why did you look so frightened?" He inhaled sharply, then forced a low laugh. "Margaret, it's nothing. Standard procedure. They dig up old files now and then, hoping for miracles. You know how the FBI works. All bureaucracy, no heart." But his tone was clipped, rehearsed, as if he'd memorized lines for a play. She studied the curve of his jaw, the beads of sweat at his temple. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice firmer now. "I've lived beside you for nearly 50 years. I know when something's wrong." He rolled over, his back to her. "I'm tired. It's been a long night. Don't start this now." Margaret's chest tightened. For decades, she had trusted his word, leaned on his strength. But tonight his walls felt higher, impenetrable. The distance between them in bed stretched wider than oceans. She lay awake, listening to his steady breathing. It should have comforted her, the rhythm she'd known for almost half a century. Instead, it felt foreign, mechanical. Like a metronome keeping time for a man she no longer recognized. In the darkness, Margaret's mind replayed Collins's words. Someone close to David may have withheld details. The phrase gnawed at her, refusing to let go. Beside her, Harold shifted, muttering something inaudible. She caught only fragments, broken words, half-dreamt, half-confession. And in that moment, Margaret realized the silence between them wasn't safety. It was secrecy. Dawn crept into the room, its pale light laying bare the lines on Margaret's face. Sleep had eluded her. Instead, memories had marched relentlessly through the night. Now, as she sat at the edge of the bed, she let herself sink into the past. The night David disappeared, the night her world fractured. It had been late, a summer storm rattling the windows when David came home after another heated argument with Harold. Their son's voice had cracked with anger, accusing his father of being too controlling, too cold. Harold's booming reply shook the walls, words Margaret tried to forget but could never erase. "You'll respect me in this house or you'll leave it." Margaret remembered standing in the kitchen doorway, frozen. She had wanted to intervene, to soothe them both, but fear kept her rooted. When the shouting stopped, David stormed out into the night. That was the story Harold told her later, that their son had left, slamming the door behind him, never to return. For years, Margaret clung to that version. It was easier to believe David had walked away than to confront darker possibilities. She told herself she had misheard the edge in Harold's tone, misread the panic in his eyes when she asked what happened after David left. But now, recalling those moments with new clarity, the inconsistencies sliced deeper. Why had Harold's shirt been damp that night, not just with sweat but with what looked like rainwater, when the storm had passed hours earlier? Why had he insisted she never call the police until the morning? And why, when she begged to search the woods, did he grip her arm so tightly and say, "It's no use. He's gone"? Margaret's heart pounded as the weight of those details pressed harder. At the time, she had buried her doubts, convincing herself her husband was simply grieving, coping in his own way. But in truth, she had silenced herself out of love, or perhaps fear. Now, decades later, that silence felt like complicity. She rose from the bed and walked to the window, staring at the backyard where David once played catch with Harold. The grass looked ordinary, yet in her mind it became a stage of ghosts and questions. Margaret realized she could no longer ignore the cracks in Harold's story. She needed answers. Answers the FBI might uncover, but ones she had to confront herself. Margaret's hands trembled as she slid the FBI agent's card into her purse. The decision had taken shape in the pale light of morning. She could no longer wait for truth to find her. She had to reach for it herself. When Harold left for his errands, muttering about hardware supplies, she knew it was her only chance. The cafe was small and tucked into the corner of town, a place Harold rarely visited. Margaret sat in the back booth, her coat still buttoned, her eyes fixed on the door. Minutes later, Agent Collins appeared, his presence commanding yet calm. He slid into the seat across from her, his gaze sharp but softened with empathy. "Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Walker," he began. His voice carried the weight of secrets. "I'll be direct. We believe your husband has withheld information about David's disappearance." Margaret's throat tightened. "What kind of information?" Collins leaned in, lowering his tone. Witnesses reported hearing not just shouting that night, but something heavier. A crash, like furniture breaking. One neighbor even claims she saw your husband carrying something large out toward the woods. At the time, there wasn't enough to pursue it. But now, with new forensic methods, we've reopened the trail. Margaret's breath stuttered. The words clashed against every defense she had built over decades. She wanted to scream that they were wrong, that Harold would never harm their son. Yet her mind replayed the damp shirt, the grip on her arm, the silence that followed. "He told me David just left," she whispered, more to herself than to Collins. The agent studied her. "Sometimes, Mrs. Walker, the people closest to us are the ones who hide the darkest truths." Tears stung her eyes. She was torn in two, half clinging to the man she had loved for nearly 50 years, half recoiling from the possibility he had destroyed everything. When she left the cafe, the afternoon sun felt harsher, the world too bright for the storm raging inside her. Each step home echoed with dread, her loyalty battling a growing fear. What if Harold's version of their life had always been a lie? The house smelled of roasted chicken when Margaret returned, as if Harold had wrapped the evening in domestic comfort. He stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, humming softly, too softly. The scene should have been ordinary, yet it felt staged, like a play designed to distract her from the storm inside her chest. "Where have you been?" he asked, his tone casual, though his eyes lingered on her purse longer than necessary. "Out," Margaret replied, steadying her voice. "Harold, we need to talk. About David. About what happened that night." He sighed dramatically, setting down the knife with a clatter. "Margaret, not this again. After 47 years, don't you think it's time to let the past rest?" Her resolve hardened. "The FBI doesn't think so. They believe you know more than you've told me." Harold turned sharply, his expression wounded. "Is that what you think? That I've lied to you? My God, Margaret, I've given you my whole life. How could you stand there and accuse me?" His words struck with the precision of a blade. She faltered, guilt blooming in her chest. He stepped closer, cupping her face in his calloused hands, his touch tender but suffocating. "I love you," he whispered. "I've loved you through everything. Through David's disappearance, through every sleepless night. And this is how you repay me? By doubting me?" Tears welled in her eyes. His voice dripped with sincerity, yet somewhere beneath it she heard steel, the command of a man desperate to control the narrative. "You're letting them poison you," he continued. "Those agents don't care about us. They don't care about our marriage. They just want someone to blame. Don't let them turn you against me, Margaret." "You're stronger than that," she nodded faintly, though every fiber of her being screamed in conflict. His hands, his warmth should have comforted her. Instead, they felt like chains tightening, dragging her deeper into doubt. Later that night, as she lay beside him, his breathing steady in the dark, Margaret stared at the ceiling. For the first time, she wondered if she was losing her grip on reality, or if he was skillfully unraveling it. The following morning, Margaret found herself walking down Maple Lane, her feet moving almost of their own accord. She hadn't visited Mrs. Greer in years, not since the woman's health began confining her to the front porch and neighborhood gossip. Yet something about the gnawing in her chest pushed her there. She needed a voice outside Harold's, someone who might remember the night her world collapsed. Mrs. Greer sat in her rocking chair, a blanket draped across her knees, her eyes sharp despite her frailty. When Margaret approached, the old woman's face softened with recognition. "Margaret Walker," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "I was wondering when you'd come." Margaret forced a smile. "I needed to ask you about that night. When David disappeared." The rocking slowed. Mrs. Greer's gaze drifted to the trees lining the street. "I heard things that night. Not just shouting, everyone heard that. But later when the house went quiet, I heard another sound. A crash, like something heavy falling. Then I saw Harold. Margaret's breath stalled. "You saw him?" Mrs. Greer nodded. "Through my kitchen window. He was carrying something. Could have been a rug, a bundle of clothes. Hard to tell. But he walked toward the woods behind your house. I never told anyone. Thought it wasn't my place. But the look on his face..." She paused, her lips trembling. It wasn't grief. It was fear. The world tilted beneath Margaret's feet. Her fingers clutched the porch railing for balance. She wanted to defend Harold, to argue that grief twists faces, that memories blur over decades. But Mrs. Greer's words landed too neatly on the cracks already spreading in her mind. "I thought you should know," the old woman finished softly. Margaret murmured thanks, though the word tasted bitter. As she walked home, her heart pounded against her ribs. Mrs. Greer's voice echoed inside her skull, weaving itself into the doubts she could no longer silence. By the time she reached the front steps, her foundation of trust had fractured. For the first time, Margaret saw Harold not as her husband, but as a man capable of terrifying things. The memory of Mrs. Greer's words lingered like a sour taste Margaret couldn't wash away. That night, as Harold snored heavily in the bedroom, her eyes drifted to the hallway, to the cellar door at the end, painted the same pale cream as the walls, yet always locked, always off limits. For 47 years she had never questioned it. A husband's workshop, Harold had said. A man's private space. She had accepted it as wives often did. But now the door pulsed in her mind like a wound. The next morning, Harold announced he needed to pick up lumber. "Won't be back for a few hours," he said, pressing a perfunctory kiss against her cheek. Margaret waited until the sound of his truck faded down the street before she moved. Her hands shook as she rifled through the top drawer of his desk, searching for the key she had seen him pocket countless times. When the cold metal finally touched her fingers, a shiver ran through her. The house seemed to lean in, listening as she walked to the cellar door. The key turned with a reluctant click. A breath of stale air rolled upward, damp and heavy, carrying the scent of rot and rust. She flicked the light switch and a single bulb buzzed to life, casting a weak yellow glow down the narrow stairs. Each step groaned beneath her weight. The cellar was cluttered with tools, boxes, and old trunks, the detritus of decades. But it was the corner, hidden beneath a sheet of canvas, that pulled her gaze. Heart pounding, she yanked the fabric aside. There, leaning against the wall, was a baseball bat. Dark stains marred the wood, blotches that time hadn't erased. Beside it lay a folded jacket, faded blue with a patch on the sleeve. David's jacket. She remembered buying it for him the Christmas before he vanished. Margaret's knees buckled. A strangled cry tore from her throat, echoing off the stone walls. She clutched the jacket, pressing it to her chest, inhaling the faint scent of mildew and memory. Her scream rose higher, filling the emptiness of the house above, reverberating through every room that once held laughter. And in that moment, Margaret knew. The answers she feared had been hidden under her own roof all along. The front door slammed shut just as Margaret staggered up from the cellar, David's jacket clutched to her chest. Harold's heavy boots thudded across the floorboards, his voice echoing from the hallway. "Margaret, I'm home." She stood frozen in the living room, her knuckles white around the faded fabric. When Harold entered, his eyes fell immediately on the jacket. His face drained of color, then hardened like stone. "Where did you get that?" His voice was low, dangerous. Margaret's throat burned, but the words erupted anyway. "From the cellar. The place you've kept locked from me all these years." "Why, Harold? Why was David's jacket down there, right beside a bat covered in blood?" He stepped forward, hands raised as if to calm her, but his eyes glittered with panic. "You shouldn't have gone down there. You shouldn't have seen that." Her voice cracked into a scream. "Tell me the truth. After 47 years of lies, tell me what you did to our son." The silence that followed stretched unbearably. Then Harold exhaled, shoulders sagging. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he muttered, almost to himself. "David," he was shouting, pushing me. I lost my temper. I grabbed the bat. I only meant to scare him. His gaze flicked to hers, flat, unrepentant. He fell, hit his head. "It was an accident." Margaret staggered backward, nausea rising. "An accident? You buried him like a secret, let me grieve alone, let me believe he'd run away." "For decades, Harold." He shook his head, stepping closer, voice tightening. "I did it for you, for us. You wouldn't have survived the scandal, the shame. I carried that burden alone so you could keep living. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. You carried nothing. You left it for me to carry. The questions, the silence, the endless hope. You let me beg for answers while you slept beside me night after night. His jaw clenched. Don't you see? I protected this family. You should thank me. Margaret's body went cold. In his eyes she saw no guilt, no sorrow. Only justification, a twisted pride in his control. The man she had loved, the man she thought she knew, was nothing but a mask over something darker. The jacket slipped from her hands, falling to the floor between them. For the first time, she did not see Harold as her husband. She saw him as her son's killer. The sirens drew nearer, their wails slicing through the heavy silence of the house. Harold's head snapped toward the window, his face tightening as blue and red lights bled across the curtains. Margaret stood rigid, David's jacket at her feet, her hands still trembling from the call she had made minutes earlier. You called them, Harold whispered, his voice breaking into disbelief. Then his eyes darkened. After everything I did for you, Margaret. You called them? She said nothing. Her throat was too raw, her chest too hollow. All she could do was watch as the front door burst open and Agent Collins entered. Flanked by 2 officers. Harold Walker, Collins announced, voice cold and commanding. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and suspicion of homicide. The cuffs snapped around Harold's wrists with brutal finality. He thrashed once, then steadied, his gaze locking on Margaret. His face twisted with venom and sorrow, a grotesque mask of love and fury entwined. You think you're free now? He spat as the agents pulled him toward the door. You'll never be free of me. I'm part of you, Margaret. Part of this house. Part of what you are. His words clung to the air like smoke. Margaret's knees weakened, her body trembling between heartbreak and liberation. She wanted to scream, to sob, to run. Yet she remained frozen, the weight of nearly 50 years pressing down on her shoulders. Outside, the night swallowed Harold as the agents forced him into the back of a waiting car. The flashing lights illuminated his face for one last instant, before the door slammed shut. Silence settled over the house, broken only by the faint hum of the patrol cars idling at the curb. Margaret stood at the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, staring into the emptiness Harold had left behind. Her heart shattered. Yet in the hollow space where grief and love once tangled, something unfamiliar stirred. The faintest whisper of freedom. The courthouse smelled of old wood and stale coffee. The kind of place where time lingered heavily. Margaret sat in the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as Harold was led into the courtroom in shackles. His once commanding figure now seemed smaller, yet his eyes still carried the defiance that had once silenced her. The trial was not just about David. It became a reckoning of their entire marriage. Witness after witness stepped forward. Mrs. Greer with her trembling recollections of that night, the FBI with photographs of the cellar, forensic experts explaining the bloodstains that had never faded. Each word carved away at the man she thought she had known, but it wasn't only the evidence. It was the lies laid bare. The defense painted Harold as a devoted father, a grieving husband misunderstood by circumstance. Yet when Collins took the stand, recounting Harold's evasions and manipulations, Margaret saw the narrative unravel. The prosecutor's voice cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. This was not the act of grief. It was the act of concealment. Margaret's chest tightened. Every sentence struck at the years she had sacrificed to silence. The dinners eaten in quiet denial, the birthdays marked with aching absence, the nights she soothed Harold's temper instead of questioning it. Her life with him, she realized, had been its own kind of prison. When Harold himself testified, his voice dripped with rehearsed sorrow. I only wanted to protect my family, he said, glancing toward her. Margaret knows. She knows I never meant harm. His gaze lingered, as if trying to bind her once more with invisible chains. But Margaret didn't flinch. For the first time, she met his eyes without fear, and in that instant she felt the chains snap, not all at once, but link by link, breaking under the weight of truth. The verdict came swiftly, guilty. The word echoed in the chamber, final and heavy. Harold slumped in his chair, his mask of control collapsing at last. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Betrayal had hollowed her. but freedom filled the space it left behind. The house groaned softly as Margaret unlocked the front door and stepped inside. For decades, it had been a place of routine. Meals at the table, Harold's footsteps in the hallway, arguments whispered behind closed doors. Now it was quiet, emptied of his presence, emptied of the lies that had once bound its walls together. She moved slowly from room to room, trailing her fingers across the furniture. The photographs, the memories preserved in dust. Each space felt different. The silence, once suffocating with denial, had shifted into something else. A silence filled with truth. Heavy, yes, but honest. In the living room, David's laughter seemed to echo faintly, a ghostly imprint of the boy who once sprawled on the rug with his books. Margaret pressed her palm to the mantel, eyes burning. She mourned him fully now, no longer clinging to false hope of his return, no longer swallowing Harold's story of a runaway. David was gone, and the truth of it was both unbearable and necessary. Upstairs, the bedroom lay untouched. Harold's shirts hung neatly in the closet, his scent still clinging to the fabric. She sank onto the edge of the bed, clutching one sleeve in her hands. For 47 years, she had lived alongside a stranger, convincing herself she knew him, forgiving his tempers, excusing his silences. What she had called loyalty now felt like blindness. Tears slipped down her cheeks not only for David, but for her wasted years, the decades stolen by secrets, the love built on sand. Yet beneath the grief stirred something fragile. Possibility. Margaret rose and opened the window. The evening breeze carried in the scent of cut grass, fresh and alive. She imagined repainting the rooms, selling the furniture, maybe even leaving the house altogether. For the first time, she allowed herself to picture a life not dictated by Harold's shadow. The silence no longer trapped her. It gave her space, to grieve, to breathe, to exist without chains. She closed her eyes and whispered David's name into the stillness, a prayer, a promise. The sound carried softly through the house, and for once she didn't flinch at the echo.